this week's theme is industry research. We're going to be talking about industry research careers for PhDs and postdocs. We want you to be smart in thinking about your career goals. And in post-pandemic world, the things are going to be very different. So therefore, you should be planning it right now. I'm going to start, first of all, by asking all of you to introduce yourself briefly and talk about your career journey. So I'm going to say the name so that it's easier for us to follow. How about we start with Megan first?
Okay, hello. Thank you, Harinder, so much for hosting this. My name is Megan Newcomb, and I was very recently in grad school. I actually defended in December and started my new industry position in January. So my PhD is in chemistry. I worked for the RIBI lab, and most of the work that I did was more molecular biology. And as part of my PhD research, I grew a lot of bacteria. I did a lot of fermentations, and so I applied for fermentation scientist positions, primarily in the Bay Area and in Southern California. And now I work for a startup company, a biotech company in San Leandro, which is in the Bay Area. And my position is fermentation scientist, so it's a scientist one position. So it's only been 7 months, so there hasn't been much career movement so far.
Well, thank you, Megan, for coming back. In spite of the fact that you just started, you still were able to find time to come and see us. I know things might be super difficult depending on how things are going. And also I want to tell people that Megan is our alumni of our GPS 10 program at UC Irvine, and so is Brandon. So why don't we move over to Brandon now? Hello, Brandon.
Hi, Harinder. So hi, everyone. My name is Brandon Matthews. I also received my PhD in chemistry. I think we're the same year, right, Megan?
I'm not sure.
Yeah. But so my PhD, I mainly focus on analytical chemistry, analytical science, a lot of surface modification, surface detection, nanoparticle and ensemble measurements, that sort of thing. And so when I wanted to make the transition out to industry, most of the jobs that I applied for were more for a research and developmental chemist and an analytical position. And so I've been at my current job for about 8-9 months, I think. And so I don't do the exact same thing I did in undergrad, or excuse me, grad school. Whereas now I still develop sensors, but now it's gas and liquid-based sensors. And we can talk more about that, but in essence, I kind of parlayed what I did in grad school to get my current position. And while it's not a one-to-one transition, it covered enough where I got the job. And so I'm pretty happy there, all things considered, so.
Perfect.
So I'm a senior scientist about 20 minutes south of UC Irvine in a city called Aliso Viejo. So I work at Neogenomic Laboratories, which is a cancer diagnostic company. So when I got my PhD from UC Irvine a while back in 2014. And so I was mostly, my PhD is technically in biological sciences, but I did mostly molecular work. I was working with cancer and immunology, virology, in the different labs that I worked in, but mostly molecular biology kinds of things, tissue culture, Western blots, all that kind of jazz, PCR. And so after I got my PhD, at that point, I pretty much knew that I wasn't really going to stay in academia, but I went and did an academic postdoc anyway. And the person that I did my postdoc with, two-body problem, so I ended up going to UC Riverside, so I stayed nearby for my postdoc. The lab that I went into, he graduated a lot of postdocs going into industry, right? He wasn't trying to filter people into going to academia per se. And so we sort of agreed at the beginning that it would be sort of a shortish postdoc. So I was there for a little under 2.5 years. So it's just rather, you know, get some projects, get some publications, get the knowledge under your belt, and then leave and go to industry. You know, he didn't see the need to waste any time, you know, staying in academia if you knew you weren't actually going to stay there permanently. So, so after the postdoc, then I took a short break before looking for positions in industry. And so most of my postdoc was still molecular based, but I had branched into like immunohistochemistry kinds of techniques, specifically fluorescent based. And so that's the position that I sort of have now, the research and development position that is in my sort of corner of the company, supporting pharma services, pharmaceutical drug trials and things like that, is mostly IHC based and fluorescence based. So I've been here for a little under 2.5 years now, and my role has sort of continued to develop. I came in as a scientist one, and now I'm a senior scientist. And so now I actually also manage the lab that we run, that I came into to be an R&D scientist. And so I help manage the wet lab operations as well as being involved with client interactions.
Thank you, Erin. We can go to Gilbert now.
Hello, my name's Gilbert Martinez, and I got my PhD even longer ago than Erin, and it was, during the midst of the recession, and I really didn't know what I wanted to do, so I did a postdoc because they're not really that hard to get because you don't get paid much money. So I was very productive in that first postdoc experience, but it went terribly because, there's some advisors who are not the best. But at that point, I thought I really wanted to be in academia because I, helped get several R01 grants. So I joined another lab for a second postdoc and started to build a research program for my eventual lab. But then I ended up in a relationship, and the two-body problem came in, and our deal was whoever gets the best academic job first determines where we end up. And my partner got a job at Chapman University. And so I was looking both academic and industry positions in Southern California, and something came up at the time was Allergan, the Botox company, doing biophysical characterization. So I took a senior scientist position doing biophysical characterization, and really they kind of wanted me to just provide routine testing support initially, but that soon morphed into more and more responsibility, including leading the whole biophysical characterization for Allergan. And this was last year, so it all happened so quickly. And in May, we just got acquired by AbbVie, which is a larger company. And so now we are combined like the third or fourth largest pharmaceutical company in the world, which is a little crazy and not at all what I imagined I would be doing. But it's been a pretty great experience so far.
Awesome, thank you. So that was really nice introduction. We had a good start, but it's interesting to see that we have really half and half. Two of you actually only did PhD and then got into industry, and Erin and Gilbert did brief postdocs or long postdocs and then got into industry. So I'll get to that point very soon, but if I can ask next natural question about more about your company, what you exactly do, and then I think that'll connect it to how's that different from academic research lab. So we can go in the same sequence, Megan.
Okay. So I work for a startup company called Geltor Inc. So Geltor is about 5 years old. We just hit 50 employees, and half of those are operations business side. So there aren't that many scientists. And Geltor is a very cool platform. It's a bacterial expression platform that we use to produce proteins that are typically derived from animals. And so our goal is to make sustainable vegan alternatives to collagens. Right now, it's our big protein, but we have other proteins in our arsenal. And so by producing vegan sustainable alternatives to collagens, we can provide those to beauty products as well as food products, which is what I'm most interested in. And day to day, my job is to run bacterial fermentations to produce those proteins. So each week, I'm either screening new bacterial strains to produce new proteins, or try to make more of those proteins, or I am optimizing fermentation conditions to maximize the yield of our target proteins. So that means I'm literally running the bioreactors. I'm probably designing the experiments to decide what we're running each week, and then monitoring, collecting data, and then quantifying our yields of different proteins week to week. And then on top of that, there's some other work to be done to kind of help with other portions of the company, which is one benefit of a startup, is that my work is not just fermentation. I'm able to help with other stuff. I think one of the best things about it is that if something fails, you move on. You don't have to keep working to make something work if it's not going to work, because it's a waste of time and it's a waste of money and resources. So it's really nice to not have to repeatedly fail at something aiming to get it to work. The pace is very fast in general. For a startup, things change constantly, which I find very exciting, but I think some people could find that a little disconcerting. My boss is, there's a lot more like business-wide goals. I would say my boss is more interested not only in my personal well-being and my growth in the company, but the overall business. Whereas depending on your PI, of course, their perspective might be a little bit more narrow. Their goal is a little bit more narrow. And yeah, that's all I'll say. My boss has a more broad appreciation for all of the things that need to happen well and such to support the overall company versus his own goals.
That almost sounds like a very different business model. Here in academic business model, you're doing all the research, generating data, publishing papers to get the grants. However, on the industry side, seems like, of course, revenue is important. At least getting the product out in the market is important, and it's more translatable. And I believe there are more rewards compared to doing basic research in academia. Here, how about we move over to Brandon now?
Sure. So much like Megan, my company is on the smaller side. It is intentionally kept like that, where I think we just passed like maybe 35 employees, but the company's been around for about 20-ish years or so. And so I guess just doing the direct comparison to grad school to now, my day-to-day tasks kind of vary as the company itself, his name is, I work at a place called Intelligent Optical Systems, but that is kind of a misnomer now as it's gone through a lot of changes over the years. And so the only thing that kind of links all the various projects and employees together is that we use the same device that measures phase shifts when there's surface binding or surface adsorption, events occurring, or some sort of pH change and whatnot. But beyond that, we're kind of, it's interesting because I didn't realize this when I first applied, is that a majority of the funding that we get at the company is actually government-based grants. And so whereas we're not necessarily concerned in the traditional sense of industry for our customer base, we go in knowing what we have to accomplish. These are the tasks and the goals and milestones that we have to hit in order to get paid at a predetermined set of time. With that, however, is a lot of people are kind of incrementally placed, meaning that I myself, when I first started, I was on one project. Then for a short period, I was on 5, and now I'm down to 3. And so the company is kind of like, be aware of all the projects that you fall under for your particular umbrella. So either sensor projects or more biological-based projects. But with that, you're not expected to work on all of them at all times. You are expected to work very hard, and is why I was late today, because I had to do some last-minute things for a coworker. It happens, which is probably the biggest change actually from industry to from academia, where your coworkers sometimes don't actually know all the things that you do for them, and that's intentional, and that they don't need to know because it's not relevant and they can move on. And this is one piece that you apply. They know what to do with it. They don't need to know all the ins and outs, and then they can move on with their side of the project. Relating back to my day-to-day stuff, so because of the pandemic and everything going on, there's been a fair amount of like change up and shifts in the company. And so whereas before I was strictly an R&D chemist, I did data collection, I worked it up. I reported to my manager at the time, he has decided to step down for personal reasons. So now I do all that work, but I'm also taking on more of a project manager sort of role as well, where I communicate more so with the customers. I help with the monthly reports and whatnot. And so I guess it's almost like my current stage is like grad school on steroids. It's kind of interesting. I've learned a lot because it is smaller and because you kind of shift around to so many different projects that you're in being there just for the 8 months. I actually realized I know a lot more and I've become a lot more comfortable in the company, even though I didn't go for a postdoc like a number of other of my coworkers did. But that didn't leave me as a detriment in my day-to-day work. And my supervisor is very so much more beneficial to my improvement and growing versus grad school, where he's concerned, where it's like, can you handle this work? There's a lot of things that you have to suddenly do. Let's be as accommodating as we can for the pandemic, but we also have to make sure our customers are satisfied because this is a lot of money that they're giving us. And so it's just kind of a balancing act between it all. Not unlike grad school to an extent, but basically the more you get into it, it gets easier over time. It's just kind of jarring at first where it's like, oh, I can clock out and I don't have to worry about work until tomorrow morning. This is fantastic. And I get paid so much more. So yeah, that's pretty great for industry.
So now we'll move over to Gilbert and Erin, because both of you are working in, if I can say, large, mid to large size companies, and both of you have done postdocs. So it's really, I'm curious to hear what your experience has been since you did postdoc, maybe had a better sort of an understanding of academic landscape, and then transition into an industry, mid to large size industry. How's that role different from your postdoc research? And sort of like what main differences you see between academia, maybe startup if you were in, or in the large company?
Yeah, so I did 2 postdocs, and from graduate school, I had undergrads that I mentored, so I always had that mentoring experience, and that certainly paid off as a postdoc. If you want to be successful, you know, or as a PI, you're going to have to manage people. So I learned that as a grad student, and that was something that was just important to me in general, regardless of what my trajectory was going to be. So I kept that as a postdoc, and was able to do more experiments because I had several undergrads working with me, and that was very helpful because it, at least my position in industry, it's, you have one meeting in the morning and you're doing X, and then, you go grab a coffee, go to the restroom, and then you have another meeting about Y. And then, after lunch, you have 2 more meetings about 2 completely different things. It was like my postdoc on steroids, to use the other metaphor. Like it's just so much more complex. There's so many things going on, so many project teams. And since we've been acquired, we're trying to communicate better than we had before. And you find out that, other departments really could use your expertise and they hadn't been. So we're trying to integrate that. So it's, one meeting after troubleshooting, and we want to do some basic research too, now that we have a little bit more money with the acquisition. So, starting to do that and like having to go back and go to PubMed and do some of that research has been fun. But it wasn't something that I had to have much, I didn't spend much time doing until the last 3 months or so. But the first 6 months of my position was just kind of learning what to do, and the regulatory requirements, and getting clearance to actually work with some of the molecules. And yeah, it just kind of skyrocketed and spiraled out of control as far as the number of things to go, and like the different groups you have to communicate with. Like we have a a fermentation group. I don't have to grow any of my protein anymore, or I don't have to purify any of my protein anymore. But we talk to the fermentation scientists because, we need more samples. So like, okay, how can we try to make it better? What are the critical quality attributes that you should be looking for that lead to bat stability? So there's just a lot of crosstalk between the different groups. And the biggest difference for me is that you need the success of everybody on your team, because if you want a good product, it needs, from the first step to the last step, it needs to be done right. And in academia, a lot of times it's, oh, I'm doing this all myself, I'm not going to share any of my information. But no, you can't do that. And it's such a liberating experience to be in an environment that, reliance on your colleagues success is very important. It's not just you, it's the team. And I really like that change.
So Erin, what do you think about, your experience with and working in a large size company? Would you consider NeoGenomics as a large size company?
Yes. Overall, NeoGenomics is quite large. The portion of which I work in is sort of smaller. So we have, since Neo is primarily a cancer diagnostic testing company, then we have a huge clinical side of things. And then the smaller portion of the company, I think we're like over 100 people at this point over in the pharma services. Then we have sort of completely separate projects. Sometimes projects will bridge, but most of the time our projects are separate. And then within pharma services, the multiomics group that I work in, we have about 20 people. So it's sort of like being in a university where there's lots of people, but then your lab is much smaller. The number of people who are in multiomics are larger than the labs that I worked in as both undergrad, grad school, postdoc. So there's more people. So I absolutely agree with Gilbert. Communication is top notch. Like you're communicating all throughout the day. And I would also echo as well that the number of things that you end up working on, right? Since we're a client-driven company, then the different services that we're providing, instead of going to go get grants, you're trying to get paid by your customers. So you're meeting specific turnaround times. So some of the things that are different from being either a grad student or a postdoc is you have very defined goals. And even though theoretically you're supposed to have defined goals as a grad student or postdoc, the time frames can vary, and you have to hit your head against the wall and you try the same thing over and over again, trying to get it to work, as Megan said. Here it's a lot more structured. And so we have certain deadlines that we have to hit so that you can get certain revenue generated. And since there's different parts of the company, so there's a different part of the company that actually handles like the samples coming into the company, putting them into our laboratory management system. And then they go to a different portion of the company in order to actually get one kind of testing before the samples are actually routed to our lab. So it's like one giant collaboration. Like we're all on the same team. We all have to do our own part in order to make it happen, to make the study successful. But like nobody's an island. You have to rely on everyone within, in my case, like smaller multiomics, but I'm constantly working with the project managers, with the accessioning team, everybody, right? So that's something that I appreciate. I like being part of the team and collaborating and not having to be like the one person who has to know and do everything, right? Like it's a team effort. In terms of the fact that now, I run the lab, I don't do as much personal wet lab work as I had originally thought that I would do when I joined the company. Somebody stepped down as the lab manager, and so I stepped into that supervisory position, and that was a learning curve in of itself. And so now I manage the day-to-day operations of the lab. So I need to have a certain level of understanding all the projects that are going on. Even though I'm not personally responsible as like the scientific lead, I need to know enough of what's happening, the status of the project. And so I end up joining pretty much all of the, like the client interaction, like interfacing calls that we have. Most of the time it's bi-weekly, but when you have 20 or 30 projects ongoing, then it adds up. Thankfully, they're bi-weekly. Some are monthly, those are nice, but yeah, I end up having a lot of WebExes, a lot of this, except without video, because most of the time we don't do video. And so even though I'm not like the main driver of a bunch of those projects, I still have to be in communication enough and know enough of what everybody else needs to do to sort of track it down. You know, I'm sort of the grease between the different cogs, is sort of how I think of myself for a bunch of different projects. And then I actually lead projects myself, like I'm the study lead. So then I am the person on the WebEx call giving updates, how are things going, having the scientific discussions, having the report out of their data, and things like that. I would say that, you know, in terms of, at least at NEO, you guys can't read it because it's very small, but this happened behind me. This happened to me. I just happen to be sitting in a conference room where it's displayed. But we have a focus chart for 2020. Every year we have a focus chart of like, what are our goals? What are the quality goals? What are the attributes of the company that they want to inspire in the people who are working here, and where are we going to go from here? And so back in grad student postdoc land, I didn't really feel a whole lot of care and support from the PIs that I worked with, right? It's like, here's your project, don't screw up. And then every time you'd have your meeting with them, they're like, you're screwing up again, right? So that's mostly how I felt a lot during my PhD and postdoc years. But here, yes, revenue is important, but if somebody leaves, that's really detrimental. And so, you know, they want to make sure that we have a career development path, and we're happy. Because of COVID-19 schedules, the lab now runs on certain days. It runs 7 days a week to try to do socially distancing for certain of the lab members who are higher risk. So we start at 2 in the morning, and on certain days we don't end until like 11 or 12 at night. And since I'm the supervisor, then I'm technically sort of on call. Not that I'm necessarily, like they're not really reaching out to me at that time, but you know, it's a different kind of, you know, I don't clock out as much as I guess I thought I would in industry, where it's like, oh, it's fine, bye guys. And that may just be me. I don't want to leave my team hanging when they're working on something. And when it's patient samples, there's a lot more regulation. There's a lot more different systems, different computer systems that have to be up to certain levels of certifications, different kinds of documentations that have to be controlled documents, all of these sorts of things that are very different from academic life. You know, academia is just like, oh, here's an experiment, I run it, bam, done. Here it's like, well, to start up the study, we need 4 to 6 weeks to go over all the paperwork and have all of the statements of work signed and the contracts and get it into our document controlled system and all this kind of stuff. So that's very different, you know, the level of documentation that you need and control, but it's for patient care. So I understand that level of tracking is necessary. And so I actually work pretty heavily with our LIMS team for developing the module that we use in multiomics. So that's, you know, sort of a different random hat that I ended up wearing. I'm not sure how I got volunteered into that position. Just started answering some questions, and then suddenly I became the person. So, you know, you kind of find the different things that are interesting to do. But that's been a very good learning experience in terms of the level of tracking that needs to be taken, because when you're dealing with patient samples, you know, the clinical side requires a lot more stringent regulations than in academia.
And we've also heard something that, you know, once you get and start, you know, companies start working on a project, and if it doesn't lead to the results you were expecting, they just throw that idea out. they just remove that, basically defund the project and move on and start something new. Is that really true in industry? Please go ahead. Anyone can answer based on your experience now.
I would say yes and no. It depends on what part of where in the Gantt chart you are. Gantt chart is something that you hear a lot about in industry, but depends where you are in the process, So we've, our previous management acquired some molecules that were like, oh, well, we probably shouldn't be doing these, but we purchased them at a pretty far stage and like, okay, we have to make this work, and you're making it work, and we're making it work. But, on hindsight, I'd be like, well, is the benefit really, are we really going to make enough money from this to justify it? But when you cross a certain threshold when it's like, you have to make it work, and you just make it work. But, the discovery phase, yeah, you can throw things away that aren't working. But if you've already invested a lot, if you're in phase 2 clinical trial, you need to, really, really, really try to make it work, because that's a lot of investment that went into that.
Mm-hmm. Erin?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. We have, the vast majority of our projects are external with clients, but we also do our own R&D for internal panels that we put together, and essentially we're developing things that we would then potentially sell externally, right? So the goal is always out there to make money, to provide services. So internally, if something's not working, hey, we can easily just drop it super easily. If a client is involved and it's in a contract, it depends on the client. If the client, it's a lot about managing clients' expectations and managing the types of risks, like how early do you flag risks, how is things going? And so some clients are very willing to say, oh, hey, since we do, primarily we're doing immuno-oncology. So we're testing the tumor microenvironment, name a type of immune cell that somebody's interested in, and we're probably looking at something. And so we customize our panels for our clients. And so we have, over 150 antibodies for different markers that we've already characterized for ourselves and that we're actually using for our clients. But then a lot of people will want to come with their favorite marker, or in the clinical trial, their particular clone of antibody that they're using as a therapeutic target. And so, sometimes the clients will just, like, oh, well, that's not important. Or if we have sort of an alternative, this is where being the subject matter expert on our end, part of what we sell is that the vast majority, I think half of multiomics are PhDs. So we have a lot of, knowledge, expertise. And so we can sort of recommend and sort of shift, like, well, if this one doesn't work, how about this? This is an alternative, if we do this combination. And so sometimes we can help guide the projects. And so some of the clients, it's just not going to work. And then they have to make the decision between, if we keep banging our head against the wall and trying for something more to make it work, then it's going to impact turnaround time. It's going to impact when we can actually give them their data. And so the ones that are like, nah, cut your losses, proceed, then they're pretty easy. Other clients are very frugal, stingy frugal. They just may not have enough in their budget to keep banging your head against the wall and keep trying all the things. And so then you have to really figure out how angry they are and how much are their potential contracts. And so we may have to do some work for free in order to secure the, $1.3 million contract that's down the pipeline. Okay, give them 15 grand now, because the hopes is that they'll sign that other contract that's worth a lot more money. So those kinds of business side and revenue generating decisions, that's sort of interesting as I've grown in the company. I'm included in more and more of the sort of like business side of things. So then understanding, what are the line items, how are the contracts put together? But yeah, sometimes clients are really difficult, and being in a, customer service, like the client is always right. They're not right. And yet you can't just like tell them off and say no. You have to come up with additional solutions and try to manage that. And some clients are very difficult, and you will spend, 90% of your time placating one client because they're super, super difficult. So it can be very difficult. You have both sides of the coin. You have very sort of like easygoing clients, and then you have, thankfully, a smaller proportion of clients that can be very challenging.
That's great to hear. I have, there are two questions from the audience, and I'm going to combine those two questions. And these two questions are, well, one question is going to be Megan and Brandon both. So this is an interesting one. What are some of the things you used to believe about industry research that you don't anymore? So since both of you transitioned very recently, how has your sort of perception or understanding or myth has changed before getting into industry and now after being in industry? And second thing, do you think you should have done a postdoc before getting into this industry position?
There aren't any myths that come to mind. All I wanted from a job was a better work-life balance. I wanted to do something that I thought was impactful in the field that I care about, which is vegan alternatives to food. And I don't think that I needed to do a postdoc. I'm glad that I didn't. I am much happier now. And additionally, I feel that it's very easy to move up, at least in my company so far. I'm already kind of thinking about like, okay, how long do I want to wait before I'm like, okay, I'd like to be a senior scientist now? Or like, how long do I wait before I ask my boss if I can start to manage some new employees, people that we might be hiring soon? And it seems like the ball is kind of in my court, and that if I can be a good employee and do my best and ask for what I want, then I'll be able to get those things and not have to wait for, X number of years before I ask those questions.
Brandon, what do you think?
So that's very interesting. I actually knew by my second year of grad school that doing a postdoc will be my own personal level of hell. And so I went into it knowing that industry is what I want to do. Also because, like, echoing what Megan had said, like, I really want to focus more so on a work-life balance. Because grad school, there aren't really boundaries that you can establish that are healthy between your work and your PI, because you're a student, but you're not really a student. And so you have all this access, you have keys to the building. And so it's like work, work, work. And one of the things that I really focused on when I was gearing up to leave grad school and was applying for jobs is I wanted to live in a place that I would actually enjoy living in. And so I was only looking for jobs in LA because I'm from LA, a lot of family from LA. And so that was priority number one for me, was I need to live in a place that I will enjoy living in, because now that I'm in a job, there is no cutoff deadline for, oh, you're only going to be here for 5 years. Now it's, well, you'll be here until you'll be here, essentially. And so that kind of directed how I went about my search and what type of jobs I wanted. And the second thing I really wanted was the ability to clock out. And I keep saying that because it makes such a difference when you leave academia, where you'll get emails after you leave for the day and you will say, that's not my problem until tomorrow morning. And it's perfectly acceptable to do that now, especially now, even with a number of my coworkers working from homes, mainly management, where it's okay to say, I received your response, I'll reply in the morning, because like I'm off now and I'm hourly. Actually, that relating back to your question, Harinder, that's kind of the biggest thing to be aware of, is there is a difference between hourly and salary. It doesn't really seem like it, but when you are hourly like me, it's like, well, I am counting every single hour that I'm getting paid. And if I'm not getting paid, I don't want to work because I'm not being compensated for it. And that's a perfectly okay mindset to have in, at least in my job, hopefully in industry wide, but where it is okay to firmly establish those boundaries where it's like, I'm not doing any more work for the day, and that is okay. But much like Megan had said, like, I wasn't really caught off guard by anything once I actually got my industry job. And that's because all throughout grad school, I made it a point to, because I knew I wanted to go to industry, is to have as many mentors and as many contacts in industry, just so I can have a wide range of experiences to relate to, where it's like, okay, so you told me this, I know what to look forward to for that, and so on and so forth. So when I actually got here, it was actually really, is all things considered, it's kind of a relatively easy transition to get accustomed to what I was doing on a day-to-day basis versus grad school. And so it helped knowing what I wanted to look forward to going into a job. That kind of, I found a job that fit that, rather than trying to make myself fit into a job position that just came up because, you know, I needed a job. And like, it sucked being unemployed for a couple months, but it also was a really nice break. But yeah, so it just, knowing what I wanted really geared that, and it also helped me cut down on job opportunities that I was like, you know, like, this would be good, but realistically, do I actually want to live in this particular city? Do I actually want to do this work? And so on and so forth. And you can actually glean a lot of that during a lot of the screening rounds and kind of phone interviews and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And so you get a glimpse of what you're actually comfortable with when you get to the actual position. Because the biggest thing that one of my mentors stressed was, like, you can say no. I mean, it will suck because you have to start the entire job process over again if you do say no, but you can say no at any point in time. And also, you're obligated to work, but you don't have to necessarily work at this job if you're not happy. Like, you can leave. And there's not really a punishment for you, because what are they going to do but be mad? And so that kind of going in with that mindset of, like, you know, they need someone, they need to hire someone. So obviously, if they're interested in me, like, that's a good thing. But also, like, you still have power, even if you don't think you have power, when it comes to interviewing and saying yes or no to the ultimate job opportunity. So that was kind of the biggest thing. Just kind of confirming all the things I heard, but I didn't really experience. And then now I'm here. It's like, okay, yeah, no, this is fine. And I actually like it. So yeah.
That's good. Thank you, Brandon. And the person, Jehan, who asked question, he really liked both the answers. Thank you. So I now have a question, and these are, again, two different questions. And I know where these two questions are emanating from, because when I was a grad student, my PI, and I told him that I would like to get into industry. And the response was like, yeah, I think you should do a postdoc. The postdoc will help you to get into industry, right? And that's one of the questions. So this is for Erin and Gilbert, since both of you have gone through postdoc. What do you think? Do you think postdocs was needed to or required to get into industry positions?
So I don't think a postdoc would be absolutely necessary. You know, we have people who came into similar positions who don't have postdocs. You know, in terms of the particular skill set that I got while being a postdoc, that helped me get this position, because the particular assay and technique that we use in this company, that's the one that I got during my postdoc. I had never done that during my grad school years. So, you know, in terms of broadening your skill set, a postdoc could be helpful. The other thing that I would say that would be helpful, that doesn't necessarily have to be only gleaned through doing a postdoc, is more multitasking and collaboration. So, you know, if you have an opportunity to do more of that as a graduate student, I think that will help. That's a skill set that will serve you well when you come over into industry, because you have just your specific projects that you're working on, but then, you know, you have to help out on other ones. And so you have to be able to keep more plates in the air. I keep way more plates in the air now, right? I probably have about 6 or 7 different, like, full-blown color coordinated Excel sheets that I use to keep all the juggling happening. And so that's not necessarily like as a grad student, I didn't have that many things going on simultaneously. I had my projects, I was managing undergrads, I was being a TA because my boss was in the process of retiring, so he wasn't getting a whole lot of funding, so I had to end up TAing quite a bit as a graduate student to save the money for my actual research, which I needed the money for my research. And then as a postdoc, you do increase your level of responsibility. You have more ownership of your projects. I managed even more undergrads. I managed other master's students. I ended up running co-running the vivarium, which was a completely different skill set. Cute little mic. And so, you know, really the thing that came over most for me in my postdoc was just the level of multitasking on different projects, not only your own, but then also the particular assay. So if you have a chance to collaborate with other labs on campus, I did that a little bit as a graduate student, but you know, I do that obviously a whole lot more now. You know, trying to broaden your view and have more people that you're working with. I know that's not going to be the case for everybody's project. It really depends on how amenable your lab is, you know, how much data transfer and like knowledge you can share. But if that's something that you can do and you can sort of work into your graduate school experience, I think that'll really serve you well without having to do a postdoc before you guys come over to industry.
Thank you. Gilbert, what do you think with your experience?
Certainly the postdoc just helps. So as bad as you think grad school is, postdoc's worse. It's more cutthroat. You have less security with the grad student. If they fail you out, it looks bad on the department. So they really try to help grad students. Postdocs, they'll cut you loose at the drop of a hat in most cases. So you learn a little bit more politicking as a postdoc. And when you work in a big company, there's still some egos. You still, you know, have to deal with people, even though your success is integrated. You still have to learn to interact with different types of people, and you certainly have a little bit more experience as a postdoc. However, there's a lot of, depending on the grad school experience and what like department. If you're in a chemical engineering department, and you do, you know, chemical engineering, like large scale fermentation. If you have that experience, you don't need to do a postdoc. But if you don't have that experience, you know, you look at a PhD, it's like, yeah, they don't really know, you know, the difference, you know, like formulation development for molecules, you know, it is really just a buffer screen, but, you know, how many times you've done that, you know, kind of matters. So I think in my particular position, I might not have gotten the job as a senior scientist without the postdoc, but we do have some people who just did PhD or masters in our program or our departments, the two groups in our department. Mm-hmm. But yeah, my particular position, you know, required a lot of knowledge, and I don't know that I would have been able to get the expertise to make me an attractive candidate without, you know, 15 years of doing basically every biophysical technique imaginable. I mean, you can get that as a grad student, but, you know, if you're running the lab that does biophysical characterization, you kind of need to know everything in there and have some demonstrated competency in them. But not for every position, certainly. It just depends on the details of the position.
So that's good to know, because this question has come up many times, and a lot of students do ask me that, should I do a postdoc or not? So it's pretty much, it's not necessary, but again, it depends on what kind of job, you know, within industry you're looking for, and based on that, you have to prepare for it. Unless, you know, you have something very unique skill set which the company wants, then I guess believe you don't have to do a postdoc. But if you want to do be at a more like a manager level position, managing a research group, maybe then postdoc is required. Wants to know what kind kind of transferable skills, or what kind of like skills you learn or were very useful to transition into your current job? What are some of those things which you learned are needed at the job? Megan or Brandon, you can start, and then we'll go to Erin and Gilbert.
Yeah, sure. So it's come up a few times, but being able to communicate effectively across the company is really key, especially when you're working with people who have such a diverse array of experience. So being able to take your small specific chemical or biological problem and convey it to someone who might have less expertise or experience is super important. So I would say a lot of the things that I did with GPS STEM, then GPS Biomed, working on communication of science. So for example, elevator pitch, working on crafting good interview responses, those kinds of communication skills are super crucial. And I definitely think that my time at UC Irvine and doing a bunch of like speaking stuff helped me go to my in-person interview, give a good talk, and that really set the groundwork. That kind of made people understand that that I was a good candidate and that I knew some stuff. So that I think is really important. And then I learned a lot about resume prep, both through GPS STEM, but also by working with Lauren Lyon. And that was crucial, tailoring every single resume for a specific position, getting a lot of feedback on my resume, making sure it was as clean and as polished and professional as it could be.
Thank you. Brandon?
So I think probably the biggest thing for me was to have a teachable spirit. And what I mean by that is when you're going into industry, we all know that you have the advanced degree, and like that's great, but also you're stepping into a new environment where it's no longer really beneficial for you to speak in such a technical, jargony way, because a lot of times, one, either the people don't really follow, or two, they don't really care. And just as an example, I was on a phone call with one of our customers last week, and my supervisor was trying to tell me, it's like, they don't need to know all the details because honestly, they don't care. They just want to see their end product. And so it's recognizing that you have to decenter yourself when it comes to communicating your science and understanding where your client or customer is coming from and what they want out of the situation. And so I think GPS Biomed really stressed that, in that because you're interacting with a bunch of scientists, but they're scientists who can understand science, but they don't necessarily have your scientific background, that it comes from a position where you need to know how to communicate that effectively, but also know what's applicable or not. Otherwise, you're just wasting everyone's time. And that's which leads me to my next point, that time management and time just there's, now that I am more involved in the more managerial side of my project, there's a lot of meetings, and a lot of times I can't get all my work done. And so one of the things that GPS Biomed kind of reinforced, and also was the fact that you don't have to do everything yourself, and like you're supposed to work in a collaborative environment because you're not expected to do everything by yourself. You're gonna fail that way ultimately, and just kind of understanding that yes, you're capable and you're able, but you're still growing and learning, and maintain that mindset, and it won't cause as much grief during the transition itself. And then also relating back to GPS Biomed, I actually got my job from LinkedIn. It's miraculous if you just input that you want recruiters to contact you. A lot of them will, especially during like those periods when they are looking for jobs. I'm not going to comment on the current environment because the pandemic, but for me, what kind of helps guide me through all the interviews, screenings, whatever, was maintaining my LinkedIn profile, tailoring it to the position I actually wanted. And I learned those techniques through the various GPS Biomed events, some of which I even put on, because I used to be an intern there. But yeah, so it's just decentering yourself, I guess, ultimately, and learning how to communicate, not just science, but just from a person point of view, in that your coworkers will like you a lot more if you're amicable, especially because you will be working with them more. And if you can't do something, usually there's someone else that can do it for you. And if you're, nice to them, even if you don't particularly care all the time, they're willing to help you. And because it not only is it for the betterment of the company, but because it's like, oh, we have a cool relationship. Sure, I'll take like 5 minutes to explain something to you that's not really related to my project or something I did in the past. I can give you that knowledge so that you have it, and then the next person that comes along, like you can do the same thing. So it's all, you're constantly reaching back, and you're constantly reestablishing connections even in a workplace environment. So.
So for Erin and Gilbert, I'm going to phrase the question slightly differently because you were a postdoc or grad student a long time ago, and now you're in a position where you're looking for, you are in the process of recruitment, you look for candidates. What are a couple of like important traits, skills you look for when you're hiring new employees who have PhD or postdoc background? We can start with Erin.
It's interesting. When I was doing my interview process coming here and now being on the other side of the table, right? Actually being the person to now try and hire people for different kinds of positions. Depending on the type of position that you're hiring for, there can be very specific skill sets that you need to have, right? If it's a wet lab position, do you have wet lab experience? Do you know a particular assay? How do you run it? What is your success rate? That sort of thing, right? But there's also, what Brandon said of the fact that it's a team that you're going to be working on. And in the case of multiomics, it's about 20 people, but then you're interfacing with a lot more people. So it depends on the sort of size of your company and as it grows. I know it sounds really simple, but it's not always just the hard transferable skills, like how well do I pipette? It's hopefully you're already not a jerk, but if you can communicate that you're a nice person and that you would be a good team member to have, and probably about a third to a half of the questions that I had during my interview here at NEO was about sort of interpersonal skills and soft skills. So communication, conflict management, mentoring, things like that. Because when you have, you can learn new things, right? As PhDs, we are professional learners. If you don't know something, you can pick it up. You can go search PubMed, you can, if you like doing wet lab and you want to continue doing wet lab, you can get other new wet lab skills. But if somebody doesn't like to learn, if they're not a team player, if the fit's not right, it doesn't matter what they know. It will still be grating within your team. And you will know that there's something not quite right. You're not all pulling the wagon in the same direction. And that can be very problematic. If everybody sort of gets along, you don't have to be best buds or anything like that, but just knowing that, hey, if you need a little bit of extra work, I'll help you out. If I need a little bit of extra work, you'll help me out. That goes a long way. And so, knowing your history and your resume, like backwards and forwards and all of your hard transferable skills, but your soft skills, like those should not ever be neglected either. Communication, and how you interact with people, what you want from people, what you want from your team, what do you bring, right? It's not just your pipetting hand that you're bringing, right? You are a person, and how do you think you would also feel? So kind of like what Brandon said, is that there is power in both ways, right? You're trying to get a job, money, security, but then you don't want to go into a company where you're a bad fit either, because we've all done that in grad school. And so we know the pain of being in a job where you don't really care for your boss, or you don't feel like you are a priority, or that you're special at all. You're a dime a dozen. And depending on what size of company you're in, you are valuable, and one person can make a huge difference. So make sure that you can sort of communicate the other sort of soft skills that you have as well towards not being a jerk face when you're actually in your work environment.
That's great to know. Gilbert, would you like to add anything?
I would say exactly that. Most of my interview questions were about personality, and like, oh, if you know, the director says you need this, like, and you know they're wrong. You know they're wrong. Everybody knows they're wrong. How do you communicate with them? Stuff like that. So being able to work with other people, like, you know, it gets very tense because you're making $1 million decisions, and, you know, nobody wants to be wrong. So, you know, how do you communicate with that? So that's critical, being able to deal with different types of people. And, you know, like, obviously hard work, because, you know, most of the stuff, a lot of the instruments we have are automated. So I can teach anybody how to do that in, you know, a half a day. So, you know, it's more about, you know, thinking out of the box, right? Because a lot of stuff is automated, but, you know, how do you interpret things that are, you know, questionable? Like, you don't have a direct answer, like you should go one way or the other way. So being able to problem solve, I think, is key, and trying to tease that out. But, you know, the majority of the candidates are pretty good at that. So then it often comes down to, like, how are they gonna work with other people? Do they give anybody bad vibes? Because, you know, you get that, you know, if you have the experience where some postdoc comes and, you know, like, everybody gets bad vibes from them, and the PI still gives them the position, it can really decimate the morale of everybody else in the group. So it's really just trying to keep everybody happy. So that's what I would say is key, because you can teach a lot of people things, they can learn on their own, but you really can't teach niceness or, you know, decency.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is communication skills, teamwork, more mentoring or supervisory stuff, which you already do in the lab, and then more like out of the box thinking, sometimes even like sort of having an understanding of business concepts, you know, to understanding how the business enterprise runs, whether it's academia, industry, and a lot about being nice. With that, I would like to thank all the panelists for your time coming for the webinar and this panel discussion.